Hi, I'm Beth Betchke. Welcome to this ASQ virtual special issue on organization design. The issue is basically organized and hosted by John Eklund, Mike Lee, and Trevor Young Hyman, and I'm really looking forward to it as a topic that I've been interested in for many, many years. I wanted to just also um, say that ASQ's been doing virtual issues for the last couple of years. It was originally started by our last editor, Christine Beckman, as a way to kind of bring together a set of papers in ASQ on topics that we thought would be of interest to members of the community to have in one place to kind of bring together sub-communities around topics that we find interesting and important and relevant today. This is, I think, our fifth. And they've all been really interesting. And one of the innovations that's come along with it is having a webinar hosted by the co-organizers and having as many of the authors come together and share their work as we can and opening it up to the community. And so that's what we're going to do. And so I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Mike to start us off.
Great. Thank you, Beth, and thanks to everyone who's here. So really excited about this webinar. I think want to just start with a bit of quick framing, and then we'll get right to some of the the research presentations. But I think that partly what motivated this virtual special issue is that, many non-organizational design scholars, I think, often think of when they think of organizational design research, they often come back to the classics, right? The classic sort of theories from decades ago, whether those are theories of bureaucracy, the Carnegie School contingency theory. And, these strong associations with classic theories, I think, often lead scholars to think that not much progress has been made beyond these works. And so part of I think, what we're excited about and our intent and motivation for the special issue is really to draw attention to the recent work in the last 20 years on the topic, and that I think highlights how the field has evolved and continues to evolve. And so just kind of share a bit about our process for selecting the articles, and this is highlighted in the actual introduction to the special issue, which we will share the link on the chat as well for those who haven't seen it. So you can actually see that and actually get access to all of the articles in the special issue. We basically started with a full text search of all articles over the last 30 years that have been published in ASQ with the text and the phrase organizational design, and then we excluded those articles that weren't articles that were actually about organizational design, and that left left around 30 articles. And of those, we then conducted a kind of iterative thematic coding to really highlight, okay, what sort of are the themes of within this paper, and then develop these second order thematic categories. And what emerged were these three different categories. And within each, we had several papers within them, and we ended up selecting three papers that we think really exemplify and illustrate that theme. I do want to highlight that in the actual virtual special issue, we also cite other articles that won't be featured today, but that we think also fit that theme very well. And we really encourage folks to read all of the articles mentioned in the virtual special issue. And so just want to highlight briefly what those themes are. And these are the authors of the articles featured in the special issue and who will be presenting their research today. The first theme relates to research that has really helped open the black box of organizational design to develop a more precise and granular understanding of how and why organization design matters, especially moving beyond the kind of broad contingencies of classic theories. And I think one notable feature of this set of articles is that they use different methods. So from formal modeling to rich multi-level data sets and to large sample data using firm disclosures or digital trace data, to deal with the long-standing challenge in studying the consequences of org design choices, namely that design choices are typically endogenous and difficult to measure at scale. The second core theme really revolves around organization design as a dynamic and contested process, which contrasts with classic studies that treat design largely as a static organizational level attribute. And then finally, papers in the third theme explore organizational design choices that emerge in response to different environmental challenges and contexts. So, we view that earlier generations of organizational design scholars really emphasize how structure fits with things like the degree of dynamism in the environment and obviously an organization strategy. Now, this more recent work really illustrates how firms are or how design is evolving in response to new social and technological changes, such as climate change and the shift to virtual work. So our agenda today is pretty simple. The first part of the webinar is going to be focused on the research presentations of the featured papers, and we're going to do this by theme. So we'll give 3 minutes for each author, which is not a lot of time, but we'll hopefully have enough time to give you a snapshot of that work and whet your appetite to read the whole paper if you haven't read it. And then we'll do intersperse each theme. We'll do a short Q&A, so you don't have to sort of hold all of your questions till all authors have presented. And please input any questions in the chat, and we'll sort of be synthesizing that and bringing those questions into the Q&A session. And then the second portion of the webinar is we really wanted to expand the lens and engage in a broader conversation about the future of organization design research. We're really lucky to have two ASQ AEs, Olenka and Fabrizio, here to kind of share their perspectives. And also, I want to highlight that in the webinar chat, hopefully you can see it, there is a link to a Google form that really asks for your thoughts on sort of the current, what are some of the pressing issues in organizational design research and sort of future directions for it. And we really want to bring your perspectives into this part of the webinar, knowing that we have many sort of experts in the audience as well. And then we'll do a short conclusion. So without further ado, I want to start with the first theme of the special issue, and we're going to start with Kathy Eisenhart and her paper with Chris Bingham and Jason Davis, Optimal Structure. Turn it over to you, Kathy.
Okay, thank you, Mike, and thank you everybody for being here. This is a paper called Optimal Structure, Market Dynamism, and the Strategy of Simple Rules. And it's also one of my favorite papers of my own papers, so it's really a thrill for me to be able to present to all of you. The paper starts out with the long-standing question in organization theory, organizational behavior, strategy, network sociology, about what's the relationship between structure and performance, particularly within different kinds of environments. So what's the relationship between structure and performance? And this issue comes up in the classics that Mike mentioned, for example, Burns and Stalker, but also contingency theory with Lawrence and Lorsch, with Tushman and O'Reilly and ambidexterity, with my own work with Shona Brown on Edge of Chaos, shows up in organizational behavior, for example, in Greg Bigley's work on groups. It shows up in strategy in, for example, Melissa Schilling's work on modularity, Frank Rothermel's work as well on vertical integration. It shows up in network sociology in, for example, the paradox of embeddedness that's been developed by Brian Utsi, by Woody Powell and co-authors, and so on. So what I'm trying to convey, first of all, is the idea of structure and performance and being related to the environment is a classic topic across a variety of fields. Within those fields, there are really two major predictions. One of them is that there's an inverted U between structure and performance. So not too much, not too little, balance, efficiency, and flexibility, but an inverted U. The second prediction is that the optimal structure decreases with increasing dynamism. So the more dynamic the market the organization is in, the more likely it is to be loosely coupled and loosely structured. And the research question that we asked is, are these propositions from the past accurate? Because they rely primarily on either regression analysis or case analysis. And why this matters is, for example, if the relationship is not in inverted U, if it's skewed, it actually suggests that it's better to err, for example, on the side of efficiency versus flexibility. Also, the other question is, what does dynamism mean? Is it velocity? Is it uncertainty? Is it complexity? What does dynamism really mean? To tackle these questions, what we used was simulation. So computational modeling, similar to what was done by in the March, Cohen, and Olson paper on garbage can model. We operationalize structure as a constraint on action. And that structure could be roles, it could be hierarchy, it could be, in our case, rules. So we operationalize structure as rules, but it could be any real dimension of structure. We operationalize environment as a flow of opportunities, and we manipulate that flow. We make those opportunities sometimes more complex, sometimes more uncertain, sometimes more high velocity, that is more opportunities coming at once, and more ambiguous. It's hard to decode the opportunity. And so think of this as an organization, for example, it might have a stream of product development opportunities, and we're trying to understand which opportunities should the organization do and which should it not. And then performance is the number of captured opportunities in this flow. So you can think of this as a flow of hiring opportunities, acquisition opportunities, product opportunities. What are the results? The results, I think, are very cool. The first result is that it's not an inverted U. It actually skews to the right. What that means in real life is that it's better to have more structure than to have less. So you always want to err on the side of more structure. The second point is the uncertainty is actually the dimension of dynamism that matters. So uncertainty is what moves the optimum. Not only is uncertainty the dimension that moves the optimum, it changes the shape of the optimum. At very stable markets, very certain markets, it's a plateau, which means it doesn't really matter that much how much structure you have, because it's a plateau. You can be anywhere on the plateau. In contrast, when uncertainty is very high, it moves from a plateau to an inverted V, where in fact you're at what we call an edge of chaos. So the shape changes. So in low uncertainty markets, it doesn't really matter how much structure and performance you have, and how much structure you have. In very high uncertainty markets, it's a precise inverted V. The third set of points is about different dimensions of dynamism. For example, more complex flow of opportunities, more complex environment lowers performance. So think of how hard it is to compete in biotech when you have to get not only the technology right, but also the regulatory environment. In contrast, a high velocity of opportunities, lots of opportunities coming your way, think of AI right now, that actually increases performance. There's just lots of opportunities that can be favorable for you. And then the final, I think, insight is that ambiguity, an ambiguous market where you can't really tell what's going on, a very nascent market, that implies luck, that you really can't manage that very well, and you just have to hope you're being lucky or structure the market. So in contrast, so to sum up, which I'm not sure how many minutes I am, but I hope it's short, what are the implications? First of all, the implication is that 5 forces, the classic strategy paradigm, fits in stable markets. If you have a plateau, there are lots of optimal positions, and that fits with 5 forces. The second insight is that simple rules, which was our interest, fits many markets. It can be in a highly certain market. It can also be in a very uncertain market. And in fact, you need simple rules in the uncertain market, because that's how you stay at the top of the V. Third point is structured ventures work better. So our advice to entrepreneurs is have more structure, not less, because of the skew to the right. The next key insight is it's a good idea to shape markets, particularly if you're a skilled entrepreneur. Nascent markets are usually entrepreneurs. The markets are usually ambiguous, and it's to your advantage to shape that market and translate ambiguity to uncertainty. And finally, the last set of implications is on established firms, and why established firms have so much trouble going to new markets. And this research suggests 2 reasons. One is those organizations have to have less structure because they're in more uncertain markets. And second thing that makes it difficult for established firms is they have to manage uncertainty in a way they never had before. So they're moving from a plateau to an inverted V, making a much more difficult management challenge for individuals who are coming from established firms. So that's got it. Hope that was interesting.
Thank you so much, Kathy. So without further ado, we're going to now move to Trevor Young-Hyman's paper, Cooperating Without Co-Laboring.
Hi, everyone. Excited to share this project with you, which was really came out of my dissertation. So this paper was really engaging with the literature on knowledge work, um, literature on cross-functional teams, but also high involvement work practices and the different design choices around solving complex problems, and the idea that extending participation and knowledge exchange within these knowledge firms facilitated complex and uncertain problem solving. But the level of org design was different in these literatures. There was org design at the team level and org design at the organizational level, and there were different, it wasn't clear how these integrated. And one might imagine that there were complementarities where if there was more participation at the organizational level, this might facilitate the effect or increase the effectiveness of participation at the team level, or there might be substitutes. But there wasn't much work on this. And so that was what I was trying to do with this project. I got access to some really interesting data from two production engineering firms, actually competitors, founded in the same year, located in the same place, both doing project-based work. So those complex automated manufacturing systems that you see in the picture, that's what they did. And each one was unique, and there were project teams doing this. But one firm was a worker cooperative, and the other one was a single owner hierarchical firm. And they gave me access to their project data, the weekly labor allocations of individuals with their project teams. So I was able to match up a comparable set of projects and then look at the labor productivity on these projects, and then look at the distribution of effort between the different occupational groups. So here on one side, you can see one project team where you have a lot of cross-occupational interaction. So the lighter color and the darker colors are the different occupations. They're all working together over the course of the project. And then you have weaker cross-functional interaction. And so I was able to operationalize this degree of participation across occupations within teams, and then look at the relationship to labor productivity on these projects. And what we basically found was that in the worker cooperative, where there was high level firm level participation, the optimal level of team participation was low. So the downward sloping line, the most productive teams within the worker cooperatives were the ones in which the different occupations didn't interact, while the most productive teams within the conventional firm, the hierarchical firm, were the teams where the different occupations did interact. And to understand the underlying mechanism, I was able to collect ethnographic data within these firms, and what we saw was that when you have these organizational contexts of status hierarchy, where you have a dominant occupation at the top of the organizational structure, these cross-functional interactions are quite efficient. But when you have more egalitarian status structures within the organization, right, that conflict resolution within teams becomes costly, those interactions. Also, those org level participation structures created mechanisms for coordination outside of the team, making coordination inside of the team less productive, less beneficial within the worker cooperative. And then finally, the more even power structure within within the organization with more distributed firm level power allowed these lower status occupations to get access to knowledge management technology and other resources that allowed them to operate more autonomously. While in the other firm, the access to resources and knowledge technology was more unevenly distributed, making those interactions more beneficial. I think that there are two high-level takeaways here. The first is that org design needs to be understood as a multi-level structure where there may be greater decentralization at one level and greater centralization at the other, and that there are multiple optimal structures, even for the same type of uncertain, highly sort of novel problem solving. And the second is that in this project, we really emphasize org design as a mechanism for diffusing power and status within organizations, that the distribution of decision rights and decision authority shapes what groups are empowered, what groups are disempowered. And this then has a set of consequences for team level design and other outcomes within the firm, like their ability to solve problems or their efficiency. So thanks for the opportunity to share this work.
Thank you, Trevor. Next up, we have John Eklund.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for this. I'm presenting a paper that I wrote with Sarath Balachandran from London Business School. And what we look at here is kind of interesting in that a lot of the prior work looking at the relationship between companies' organizational design and innovation is focused within a single firm. But what we do here in extending that is looking at what the impact of the organizational design of a large incumbent firm is on the innovation of a smaller entrepreneurial organization in which it invests in terms of its innovation outcomes. So a sort of secondary effect. And what we're looking at, the key theoretical tension that we see here is that on the one hand, greater centralization of the large incumbent R&D firm investing or participating with a small entrepreneurial startup is that centralization enables rich knowledge flows within that large partner organization and across the organization to the startup. But on the other hand, centralization comes with bureaucratic burdens, and it might be much more difficult to access that information from the different parts of the partner incumbent organization that's investing in the smallest entrepreneurial startup. And what we look at in this paper are the conditions under which that greater breadth of knowledge access or the bureaucratic burdens can be overcome, and making R&D centralization, specifically of the R&D unit, have a greater or lesser impact on the innovation outcomes of the startup in which it's investing. And by innovation, we're looking at progression of inventions through development. And what we say is that if a large incumbent firm has got access to a large, broad array of knowledge, or the startup requires a large, broad array of knowledge, that's when centralization of R&D of the partner firm is really important, because you've got rich access to all of that knowledge across the organization. In terms of overcoming the bureaucratic burdens, that really helps if you've got managers within the organization who've got strong relationships with the startup, who know the organization more broadly, that can act as guideposts for the information across the organization. And then also, if you've got co-location between the incumbent firm and the startup, that also overcomes some of the bureaucratic burdens. So if you want to click down the next couple, Mike, just for the rest of the slide. So I look at this empirically within corporate venture capital, within the global pharmaceutical industry. So we look at around 18 large incumbent firms partnering up with a large number of entrepreneurial startups. And we're looking at the dyad year level between a large incumbent firm and a startup. And we're looking at the progression of drugs from preclinical to phase 1 as our innovation outcome, and the centralization or decentralization of R&D of the large incumbent firm. So if you want to skip down, Mike, last bit. In terms of what we contribute in this paper, we think that it contributes to about 4 different literatures. The one I really want to highlight is contribution to the organizational design literature, in which we show 2 important mechanisms by which org design can shape innovation outcomes in partners in which firms invest in. You've got this one, on the one hand, you've got this rich knowledge flow network in terms of centralization facilitates rich knowledge flows across the organization. But on the other hand, centralization is bad because it increases bureaucratic burdens. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. So I don't see any questions currently in the chat. So if anyone has, so just a reminder that as questions arise, feel free to put them in the chat, and then at the end of each group of presentations, we will be able to direct those to the authors. But in lieu of that, let's continue. We're going to move on to the second theme of the special issue, which is really looking at organization design as a contested process. The first paper up is Marcus Becker's piece on the mechanisms of organizational imprinting.
Thank you, Mike. So why do organizations have enduring structures even despite substantial changes in the environment? Building on prior research on imprinting, I focused on the role of the entrepreneur, and I asked, how do entrepreneurs imprint organizations? I investigated that question in a longitudinal historical case study of the Carl Zeiss firm, a manufacturer of optical instruments such as microscopes, drawing on materials from the company archives that were founded when the firm was founded in 1846 all the way to 1990. So I found that what shaped the organization design and made it enduring was blueprints for how to do tasks. That's what you see on the left-hand side. So Carl Zeiss wanted to do product development and manufacturing in very specific ways, namely science-based product development, rather than trial and error and crafts-based development of lenses and microscopes, as was common at his time. and he wanted to do high precision manufacturing rather than low precision. Now, these blueprints of how to do tasks shaped structures, behavioral imprints, and also product scope, as you see on the right. And they shaped it and impacted it. They were translated through these four mechanisms you see in the center. Through early decisions, for instance, about job roles. For science-based product development, you want to calculate lens systems, the shape of lenses, you want to make technical drawings. So they were specialized tasks that emerged and job roles that bundled these tasks. So you hired people to be draftsman or calculating specialist. Secondly, there were these blueprints for how to do tasks were translated through teaching into collective practices for doing these tasks. And Carl Zeiss and others, they taught methods for calculation and for making technical drawings. Thirdly, they were translated, these blueprints for how to do tasks were translated to structures and behaviors through role modeling. So others, they observed what Carl Zeiss and other managers did, and they imitated these as role models with regard to how to behave as a manager, to engage in product development, in making calculations, but also in managing groups and taking care of kind of marketing and so on of these products. And fourthly, these blueprints for how to do tasks were translated through formalized rules, for example, about practices, how to do these tasks, about diversification and so on, to make sure that you focus these efforts on products that allow doing certain things. So importantly, just in closing, I want to point out these early decisions and so on, they were guided by the blueprints for how to do product development and manufacturing. That's what actually gave a particular shape and stamp to these job roles, the organization units. Think of a measurement unit for high precision and so on. But that also means that choice of organization designs of these structures of the practices was driven by a choice about how to do these tasks. And there's always alternative ways of doing the task. And this is surprising because these structures could have been kind of shaped largely by choice of a model, an organizational model. They didn't say we want an M form and then they implemented an M form. Rather, Carl Zeiss said, I want to do these tasks in certain ways, and that led to certain structures and so on. Thus, in closing, my study sheds light on processes through which organization design gets created and evolves. Namely, these are processes of effortful implementation of a way of doing the central tasks in the firm. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Marcus. So next up is actually my paper, Enacting Decentralized Authority, the Practices and Limits of Moving Beyond Hierarchy. So this is a paper that really looks at how organizations can shift beyond hierarchy. And it starts from the premise that that decentralizing authority away from traditional hierarchical authority structures has long held the fascination of both scholars and practitioners. And yet it's been noted that hierarchical structures are ubiquitous and these alternative structures are quite rare. And there's a host of research across disciplines, across psychology, social psychology, and sociology that has articulated the numerous different barriers that make moving away from hierarchy, either formally or informally, very difficult. So for instance, in social psychology and sociology, we know that when groups of individuals come together, even without a formal hierarchy, an informal hierarchy emerges quite quickly. And we also know that structurally, because of the ownership structure of firms, that decision rights that are loaned and sort of delegated to other workers down the hierarchy are never owned and therefore are always at risk of being kind of reclaimed by managers and formal leaders. And I argue in this paper that existing research has actually shed a limited insight on how organizations can actually move beyond hierarchy, in part due to an ontological perspective about structure as a static entity that is imposed by organizational designers and implemented or installed and basically allowed to sort of just sort of assume to kind of continue. In contrast, I adopt a practice-based perspective on both authority and even on structure that treats decentralization not as a static structure to be imposed, but rather as a dynamic and ongoing accomplishment. And I leverage an ethnographic study of an organization going through the adoption of a radically decentralized organizational structure to study what are the actual behaviors and practices in the organization that supported moments or enactments of decentralized authority, such as managers withholding their influence and frontline workers stepping up and making decisions. And what I found were three practices, three sort of collective everyday practices that I found linked to actual moments of decentralized authority. And these were publicly codifying work roles, working from work role boundaries. So I'll take those together because I think together what those practices did and involved were, one, drawing very clear boundaries around where each person's authority began and ended, making it visible for the entire organization to see, and then also workers and organizational members actually paying attention to these boundaries and enacting these boundaries in the course of day-to-day work. And what I found is that this bounding of authority actually both limits managers from exercising undue influence, but also counterintuitively gives confidence to workers because they now know that they knew the boundaries of their authority and felt more certain about actually exercising it. And the second set of practices related to both the public codification was about how individuals started to use these work roles as a frame for their interactions. And what I found that this did is it depersonalized attributions of where authority came from, shifting those attributions from personal attributions to more impersonal attributions that authority followed the work and the role rather than the person. But the story was not all positive. And what I found is that there were frictions around the enactment and the continuation of these practices that really highlighted how these practices were really effortful and involved sort of continuous collective effort and intention. And so it was a really mixed story. And I think that the fact that this was a mixed story both highlights the possibilities of moving away from hierarchy, but also that decentralization is not a one-time structural change, but is a kind of ongoing collective process that requires continuous intent and engagement by both leaders and workers. So with that, I will turn it over to the third paper in this theme, which is Sukhbir Sandhu and Carol Kulik's paper on shaping and being shaped.
Thanks, Mike. So what we explore in this paper is the tension between structure and discretion, which has plagued organizational designers for decades. So on the one hand are the structural functionalists who argue that managers are like lumps of clay ready to be shaped by the organization. And on the other hand are the symbolic interactionists who argue that all roles are flat abstractions until an individual breathes life into them. So in our 2019 paper, we leveraged this rich context provided by the emerging role of sustainability managers to examine this tension between the constraints imposed by structure and the agency offered by managerial discretion. So in our paper, we describe three distinct configurations: the prospecting, the orchestrating, and the championing configuration. So the first one on the left. So this was a case where organizations were hiring sustainability managers just because everyone else seemed to be doing it, but there was very little formalization of the role, and the role incumbent had a very poor idea of what their role involved. And as a result, they were just collecting a bag full of ragtag sustainability initiatives designed to improve the organization's reputation. The second configuration, after no formalization in the first one, we found that organizations had started moving towards very high formalization. Sustainability had become a corporate function, and the sustainability managers in the second configuration, they were simply facilitating what the central corporate C-suite was saying, that these are the sustainability initiatives that we want to facilitate. And even there, only the ones that met the business case, so very limited set of sustainability initiatives. And we found that the sustainability managers here often felt disempowered and powerless. The final configuration on the right, this is what we call the championing configuration, which we like to call as the Goldilocks fit. Here was where the organizations were providing support, but also enabling enough discretion for the bottom-up initiatives to be able to flourish. And this is where real, meaningful, innovative sustainability initiatives were being put forth by the sustainability managers. So you'll notice that we also have horizontal arrows going from left to right. And these arrows suggest that this dance between structure and discretion isn't static in any given configuration, but it evolves over time. So conventional wisdom would suggest that we move from little or no formalization in the left towards semi-formalization and then towards high, a linear progression. Our foundings were more counterintuitive. So we found that from having no formalization, organizations can go on to highly formalize these initiatives. And it's only as organizations mature that they learn to relax and let it go a bit loose, and which enables managerial discretion to flourish. But this leap of faith of being able to let go the tight clause of formalization happens only with organizational maturity and also managerial maturity. And hence our paper about shaping and being shaped, how structure and managerial discretion shape each other over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sukhbir. So there's a couple of questions in the chat. So I just one was actually for the first set of authors from the first panel from Julia Di Benigno. She asks how the paper, if you have any thoughts on how the paper's main insights might fit together. And she said particularly Kathy and Trevor's paper, where Trevor is uncovering variation within the same environment. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a thought, and I think actually it's a really nice fit, and I'm glad Julie mentioned that, because I think what it's saying is that it's Trevor's environments aren't super uncertain; they're sort of moderately uncertain. So one would expect kind of a short plateau, which suggests there would be multiple optimal structures. And so I think the idea that there are multiple optimals kind of fits with what we said about moderate levels of uncertainty. Also, just kind of, if I can also just bring in a couple of points on what you just said, Mike, and what Sukhbir said. The idea that there was an ongoing process of managing the decentralized organization reminds me of what the edge of chaos is about. So it reminds me about that inverted V. You can't just sit there and hope it's going to work forever. You have to keep managing that balance between, as Sukhbir mentioned, structure and discretion. And so I thought both of your papers fit with that idea of there's a constant managing of the tension between efficiency and flexibility, as suggested by something like an inverted V.
Thank you. Trevor, did you?
Yeah, I was just going to add one additional piece, which is that I think another, this idea that there are multiple optima in this context of sort of moderate uncertainty, and also the fact that there is a processual, temporal nature to the way that these structures evolve over time and react to each other. So it not just being sort of a static optimum, but you create one structure and then another structure at a different level of the organization responds to it. And it sort of relates to the dynamic nature of some of the other papers that are later in the session. So.
Great. And then we have another question from Siobhan, one of our panelists. Does this process, so this is for Sukhbir and Carol. Jess, does this process unfold in a context where sustainability becomes increasingly core to the firm? Was championing a course correction to manage this?
So there's two aspects to this question. So there were external events, of course, as climate change becomes more important, sustainability becoming core to the organization. What was really interesting about our findings was that it was also the managers who were using the discretion that they had, especially in the third configuration, where they were giving these issues much more salience and the organization might have been ready for. So for example, in our case, the managers told us how in the third configuration where they had the discretion to champion, they shifted the conversation around how organizations were impacting the environment to how we were relying on the environment, a very different conversation to have. So these managers who had the discretion changed the conversation in the organization and with their peers to then enable the sustainability to become much more core to the organization.
Great. Okay, so we're going to keep moving to the third thematic category, spanning the context of organizational design choices. And we're going to start with Sarah Soderstrom and Klaus Weber's 2020 paper. I don't have the title in front of you, but Sarah, you will share it, I'm sure. Over to you.
As with so many papers, the title went through multiple iterations as we went through the process as well. Thanks for having us. And I admit I took a little bit more of a reflective approach, and so bear with me that. Our title is around organizational structure from interaction, and we use a case on sustainability in a large Fortune 500 company. And this is, I think, an example of a study that emerged through the process of doing the research. I started thinking we were going to do a multiple case comparison. And after about a week at Alpha, someone said, you know, our senior leaders are just getting ready to launch a new set of sustainability initiatives. You should hang out and see what happens. 18 months later, with many observations, interviews, archival data, it was this ending spot of building a process model of how structure emerges from interaction. And I think this was also a really strong example of how the strength of the review process can make all of our work better in that collaborative approach. I did an early presentation of this work, and a senior scholar raised his hand and was like, I just don't believe you. There's no way interactions can have this effect. It is a structure story. Where are you coming from? And I am pretty sure at least one, if not all three of our reviewers had a similar starting point in this process. And the engagement from them to really think through what are our mechanisms, what are these, what we have here is these 5 traces that move from interactions amongst people within an organization to different levels of structuration in this, again, iterative process continued to strengthen the work that we've done. The request for then long-standing supplemental materials, which I believe is over 20 pages of supplemental materials if anyone clicks through, is something I've heard from others is ended up being quite helpful for them in being able to leverage some of the work that we were trying to do here in starting and building their own research. And so I also have really appreciated how this experience has become a research conversation. And what excites me so much about the space that is here in the special issue is this ongoing conversation. When I think more reflectively around some of these lenses, my hope is that you see what Klaus and I were grappling with on the ambiguity of some of these spaces, how issues can come up in emergent ways where structures aren't in place to address them, and how interactions have this sometimes a mechanism of taking advantage of the situation, but other times these serendipitous switches in structuration in the organization that shifts what happens. I think part of this for us was motivating in the context and bringing in the importance of considering these external events, and in our case, grand challenges and sustainability quite broadly from a social and an environmental perspective, and thinking through what are the roles of corporations in reacting to that. And again, this multi-level approach to how we have not this top-down senior leader drive, but also not the valiant insider entrepreneur who is driving this vision, but really an interactive, collaborative, engaged process of social interaction, of being collaborative together in driving and understanding and shaping then this structuration. So we've been quite excited by the work, continue to be, and it's wonderful to have a chance to hear from everyone today.
Thank you, Sarah. Next up, we have Felipe and Siobhan's paper, Order from Chaos, and I think Felipe is presenting this.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it. One thing that I wanted to build on is, as Mike touched briefly on his presentation, I think this is a nice lead-in for this paper, is that the idea of decentralized organization and open participation sort of promises this adaptability and autonomy to people. And our paper is sort of about what happens when this is a motivation for organizing in a particular way, but as a collective grows, this sort of openness and lack of formal control can become its own problem. And the norm, sort of the glue between people that sustain order at a small scale can start to erode and lead to frustration and even dissolution. So in this paper, we asked, how do individuals self-organize in the absence of managerial control? And to try to understand this question, we studied Anonymous, which is a very strange, loosely connected network of activists. This behind a dozen of protest actions, some of which you probably have heard about. Anonymous emerged from a community called 4chan, where people created themes and stage pranks, mostly for fun. But at one point, they launched a very public attack on the Church of Scientology. And in doing so, they attracted a flood of newcomers into this, in what was then a fairly restricted community. And participation exploded. The off-the-shelf platforms that they use, including 4chan, to organize, weren't built for this large-scale coordination. The norms that bound the participants together began to unravel, and the coherence of early Anonymous gave way to some really chaotic forums and really growing frustration within the community. At the same time, they also grew in ambition. The attention that they got for the Scientology attacks led them to shift from online mischief to more coordinated multi-site campaigns targeting corporations and governments. And so there was this huge scale up and a lot of frustration with all this confusion and disorder that came about. What surprised us here is that Anonymous didn't revert back to hierarchy or to full control by an elite that just told people what to do. Instead, a group of veterans aimed to redesign participation itself. So you can see that in the figure here, there was a shift from normative control, where peers enforced belonging through shared language and shaming, to more architectural control, where order was achieved through a redesign of a participation architecture, sort of social technical framework that empowered technical experts and sort of quietly channeled the contributions of the masses of people that were coming to them into particular forums and allowed them to reinstate some sort of order. This paper has gotten a lot of great, awesome attention, and I get wonderful emails from a lot of you that are using this paper in your PhD seminars. I think it's been a few years since this paper launched, and now I see organizations are starting to use digital architectures and algorithmic management to make managers less supervisors of people and more curators of technology-enabled design. So my provocation for our future conversation here is, for better or for worse, the future of organizing may depend less on hierarchy and more on architectures that quietly structure participation. And we may be training more designers than we are managers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Felipe. Last but not least, we have Jen Reimer and her paper, Collaboration in Location-Independent Organizations.
All right, thank you. So this study is really phenomenologically driven, looking at location-independent organizations And by this, I'm talking about with companies with employees, but no physical office at all. So this study looks at 6 of these different organizations that are quite similar, all in the same industry, generally successful, and most importantly, have reciprocal independence in the work that they're doing. The data was collected for this pre-pandemic, so sort of 2017 to 2019. And so none of these companies had had an office at all since their day of founding. So there's sort of 2 main findings. The first one being the sort of identification of these 2 different approaches to collaboration, which I talk about as orientations. So in the table, you can sort of see the comparison between these. So it's important to note that for all of these companies, they had very traditional hierarchical structures. They were the same in this way, similar styles of working with these multidisciplinary teams, but they made intentional choices. And in my sample, they tended to do this quite early on and it didn't change, where some of the companies, those in the real-time orientation, specifically were saying they needed some overlap. And so they weren't going to be very asynchronous, whereas others, citing challenges with time zones, were saying we need to be more asynchronous. Right? And so out of this came sort of a differentiation in the norms that they had, including sort of how often they were meeting, the expectations for how they should respond to people, and sort of the focus of the study is the set of collaboration practices that came along with this. So for the real-time organizations, these collaboration practices are pretty similar to what we would expect in a lot of distributed work, right? Sort of distributed teams literature where they're using sort of some online meetings and relying on sort of shared documentation. Whereas for the asynchronous, these are a bit more interesting and really they're seeking to minimize this reliance on sort of live interaction in their collaboration process and using shared documentation, shared norms that is made out of the work that they're doing. So this isn't summaries and sort of producing shared documents that way, but it's actually that the work they're doing is all shared. It's open to everyone across the entire organization and back through time. And there's norms that come with this about being active users. And so they're expected to sort of know and understand this body of information. The implications for this are pretty important. So for the real time, we see a lot more focus on team level. There's sort of more variation between teams, negotiation on teams, and there is still this dependence on interaction, which can be disruptive or cause bottlenecks. Whereas for the asynchronous, everything's more consistent to the organization level. You have this mediation by the documentation, but there's this huge commitment and sort of effort that's required in order to make that work. And it needs to have commitment from every single person in the organization in order to be functional. So I think this is really interesting and important around this idea of sort of aligning organizational design with sort of these changes in workspace and thinking about workspace not as just physical workspace, but also the virtual workspace, and going forward with hybrid work, sort of the integration of it as well. All right, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen. So we have a time for a few questions, and I see, so there's one question that I think is really interesting about sort of looking across the papers. This comes from Pedro Montero. Thank you, Pedro. He asks, how are some of the key concepts related to org design, like formalization, for instance, used across the different papers? He observes there seems to be some differences in how they are understood and operationalized, and also in relation to the classic literature. And, maybe I can just start with just a quick observation and then throw it out to maybe some of the other authors. But, I will say that, yeah, I think that, like in my paper, in my context, for instance, like there was this public codification of roles. So it's highly formalized, but I think a couple of things make it a little different from traditional formalization. One is that the formalization was sort of a participatory process. So it wasn't sort of a centralized design process so much as it was a decentralized and very participatory process. And second, the formalization was very dynamic. So they were constantly changing these codified roles. And so in some ways it was used more like in a documentation kind of way, which I think to me gels with Jen, your context around like there's a lot of documentation in these location independent organizations. I'm curious, like I also think formalization really comes up in Sarah and Klaus, your work, and Sukhbir and Carol, your work, and Felipe, your and Siobhan's paper. So I am curious if any of you have thoughts on sort of maybe ways that formalization in this instance might show up differently in these different papers.
So one thing that really struck me when I was listening to the various panelists was the idea of formalization as an outcome of a process and formalization as the process itself. Because I think about our orchestrating configuration, and that's a place where organizations had so formalized sustainability that they had website language that our participants were replicating within in the interviews. So the formalization actually existed and was recognized. But in so many of the papers, what I'm hearing is formalization as a process. How are we going to formalize something that we're doing kind of spontaneously and organize and organically?
We can take a stab at it, maybe. I think one observation that Sarah and I walked away was that that there's a question of sort of where does the formalized come from, and then there's some official sanctioning that by some authority of sort of what we think of formalization proper, that there's some rule or some structure that is not just emergent, but that there's some authority that sort of sanctions that. And I think in our case at least, and I think that there's an interesting question whether the context here matters. The origin of what became formalized was very firmly grounded in interactions, very situational interactions. And so the material that is sort of the feedstock for formalization was really generated in those very localized distributed contexts. And the authority was sort of, in our case, was sort of multi-layered, right? So it wasn't that the organization or the very top level of the organization just sort of said, okay, here's what it is. It was still a gradual process of expanding the reach of 10 years sort of agreement within a more localized context. And so the formalization sort of happened at multiple layers where people use different forms of authority to actually formalize something that came about. I think that the main insight for me was we think of formalization as something where the sanctioning and the content sort of pop up at the same time. And in our case, at least, the two were very different processes where a lot of the material candidates for formalization were actually generated in a very emergent sort of situational process. And then there's choices. What do you formalize? Like in our case, which of those initiatives become official and which of those are sort of fall off the wayside and are not structurally sort of formalized. And I think that's an interesting sort of contrast to at least the classic literature on formalization, which sort of takes a view that someone formalizes at the same time that they come up with those rules.
Thank you, Klaus. Any other thoughts on that? Yeah, Felipe.
I think the way I've been thinking about it, at least for our paper, has been, the choice when you don't have a choice to formalize something as a rule or to really enforce those rules, to formalize things through code. There's a big legal literature on code as law and talking about how we can use architectures and digital environments to turn what we think are the right directions for people to go into chat rooms and specific places where they can go. So I think this is a new form of formalization that isn't codifying things into rules or guidelines, but into programming.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think clearly there seems to be like opportunities for some deeper theorizing around sort of the sort of varieties of formalization that we even see in these papers. So for time reason, we're going to kind of continue on to the second part of the discussion, but I just want to highlight and acknowledge the kind of, there are a couple of chats for Jen, your paper, specifically in the chat. And so perhaps there's an opportunity for you to respond there. And then I also want to acknowledge Emily Tadard, your question as well, that I think would, where she asks about thinking about the principles or theories of design extending to kind of inter-organizational systems or organizations of organizations. I think that's actually potentially a very interesting thread that we could explore in this sort of second part of the panel. So Emily, I encourage you to ask that, or we can try to bring that up in the second part of the discussion. So I'm going to turn it over now to Trevor, who will help facilitate this.
Right. Why don't we go to the next slide? So this has been fantastic, and as John, Mike, and I were putting together this this virtual collection, it was also really apparent to us that there's a wide sort of scope of research on org design going on in many literatures, and also I think that one of our kind of takeaways was that, and maybe we were sort of pushing up against a straw man, that org design is this kind of static space of research, even though I've heard people say that. I don't think that's totally an absent sentiment, and that we discovered a lot of dynamism in this area of research, particularly with what is being published in ASQ, both theoretically and empirically, the richness of the empirical data. We also wanted to be forward-looking, and we wanted to engage the audience and the AEs, and sort of panelists and kind of experts in this question. What are key pressing issues and future opportunities in org design research? And some of this stuff has already come up. But we wanted to start off by inviting Fabrizio Ferraro and Olenka Kacperczyk to comment on this. Also wanted to emphasize, and some of you have already been commenting in the Google form that we posted in the chat, we really do invite you to add more thoughts on this question, and feel free to be verbose, because we're trying to use an AI tool to aggregate. So sort of the more thoughts you have, don't hesitate to write a few sentences. But why don't we turn the floor over? Fabrizio, why don't you go first? Welcome your thoughts on this question.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well. First of all, again, congratulations. I mean, this is, again, if participants have not read perhaps the papers or the curation that you made, I mean, this is really a fantastic and excellent virtual special issue. And I encourage everybody to go through all the papers, and definitely the way you put it together in the curation piece is fantastic. And I think it was about time. I think a lot of us have been complaining that we've been decoupling, from these issues, in our conversations, even in our teaching, because our research, was not covering this topic. So it's great that we see a lot more research going on. And I think, as you nicely put it together in your curation piece, it's great to see how these pieces are really, I love the term, the org design in motion. And it's emotion in many ways. So it's enacted in daily practices. So it's, structure and enactment. As there is this tension that, of course, it's very basic to our field between structure and enactment. But it's also how organizational design is shaped by partners, is shaped by architecture. And this tension between centralization and decentralization and autonomy, which, again, I think we still need to advance our understanding of. So I think if you take all the papers together, there is this interesting fundamental tension between centralization and decentralization, static and enactment, and definitely also local action and scalability, in which you see in some of the papers. I think out of this tension, and again, first caveat, it's always dangerous to throw research ideas and opportunities out there, so take everything I say now with a grain of salt. I do think there is great opportunity to learn more from the amount of digitally captured interactions that are emerging thanks to the use of Slacks and similar processes in firms. And I think like Sarah's and Klaus' paper, Soderstrom and Weber did in the informal interaction, I think there is a great opportunity to see how these digital interactions are accumulating and contributing to the formalization of the processes. So this is something that I think can be done both either qualitatively, but also given the fact that we have textual data, also perhaps with field experiments. So this is a place where I think it's possible to do some of these field experiments. Another area, and again, I'm sorry that I have to throw these two letters there, but of course you might imagine that introduction of AI agents is going to is creating great opportunities for understanding how human kind of AI collaborations or our human code collaboration, as Felipe might have referred to, is going to evolve, because these AI agents could also be introduced in different ways in different parts of the organizations. And so we could learn more about this tension of does this lead to more centralization, or the kind of enactment that makes these AI agents operate better. Third, I think another interesting opportunity, more in terms of new roles and new unit, would be to explore how connect more this literature with the literature on power and careers, because especially with these new jobs like in CSOs or AI XR, these mandates are sometimes shaped differently, are shaped by the people that take them over. And so understand better how these new jobs create more opportunities for some people in their career. And again, it's not just qualitative, but availability of data on LinkedIn and the possibility of coding how the roles are actually constructed unobtrusively, and see how that shapes career. That could be interesting in my opinion. And finally, maybe let me just say, I do think there is an interesting, more macro research opportunity on the let's say the difference between the rhetoric and reality about new organizations, which again, many people have pointed to and we observe every day, because I think we are coding organization more and more to use that term. They are more formalized through a variety of ways. And at the same time, the rhetoric keeps continuing to be more empowerment, more agency, more democracy. And I do think that this is a strong tension that is a great research opportunity in varieties of settings. Sorry for taking a few more seconds. Thank you very much, and look forward to seeing more work in this area. Thank you.
So much for those comments, Fabrizio. Olenka, please.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. Just like Fabrizio, I'm really impressed by the collection of the papers. So congratulations to everyone. I'm also learning a lot. So I study entrepreneurship. And so as I was hearing the themes and sort of the different contexts that have been looked into across these papers, I was really amazed by the richness. And so I think that also sort of informs where I see some of those opportunities might lie. And so in particular, thinking about the different types of organization and context, I think we do have opportunities to perhaps do a little bit more comparative research, specifically thinking about how some of the issues that we study around centralization, delegation, around formalization, how specifically they might play up differently in those young fledgling organizations, startups, as compared to mature firms. And so I think one opportunity is to even think at a more descriptive level. To me, it's very valuable to think about even how some of the basic structural choices around
team configuration, around compensation, around equity splits, delegation, founder roles, how those might be unique and different in startups. And I think now we do have these days data that can actually help us map out really at the large scale some of those patterns. And so just even descriptively understanding how these structures play out in different contexts, in particular with this kind of question of startups versus established firms, to me would be really exciting. And then relatedly, I think we do have opportunities as we think about these processes of change and evolution to also, again, link it more explicitly to the literature on scale-ups. There's a lot of work these days that thinks about, at the theoretical level, thinks about the processes of scale-ups and how structures evolve and change. But I think, again, we now have the tools, have the data. So Fabrizio mentioned some of them to map those out even more specifically. So things like, when exactly are founders being replaced? How do startups organize some of those aspects as they specialize, as they evolve? Now, beyond just thinking about documenting some of those patterns, I was also thinking about some of the effects of structure. And in particular, one area which I think might be quite fruitful is to think about what structure signals to external audiences, to stakeholders. And in particular, again, if we think about startups or scale-ups, the question that I find really interesting is how some of those structural choices might be perceived as a signal by investors, but also by new hires. So as startups, for example, try to mobilize resources, what does a team structure, let's say having a solo founder team, having some type of configuration, what kind of signal that might send to external audiences, to prospective hires, and how that might actually affect the prospects for scaling. And then, just like Fabrizio mentioned, we could also think about how some of these choices, those structural choices, interact with technological choices. Of course, AI. Does AI actually change the adoption of AI? Does that change how the signal is being perceived? So for example, can AI replace some of the structure traditionally, let's say a co-founder? Can AI be perceived as a co-founder? And are startups then more able to mobilize resources cheaper, faster, better when they adopt or even signal the adoption of AI? And then finally, thinking about all these different themes, dimensions of structure, I also wondered whether it might be useful for us as a community to think a little bit more about the transparency of some of those choices. And in particular, again, thinking about startups and established firms, the question of how transparent to be, because startups are usually opaque. And I think we know very little about what is the optimal level of transparency, what drives the fact that some startups might be less transparent, more transparent, how do founders think about it more strategically? And then finally, what are the actual implications for policy? So do we want some of those structural choices to be more transparent, and what does that matter in terms of the actual consequences? So let me maybe stop here. These were some of the issues, again, that I found really interesting. And thank you so much for having me here.
Thanks a lot, Olenka, and your comment really reminds me of just how broad the opportunities are in org design research, and inevitably how challenging it was to sort of limit the papers that we were looking at. And we also did try, just to reiterate what Mike said, if you read our introduction to the virtual special issue, we cite another set of papers beyond the ones that are presented today. But there really is a great deal of opportunity in this space. So we've received some great comments as well from the audience into the Google form. And so let me share some of those. And then maybe we'll save a little bit of time. Maybe there will be some time for discussion. And so we're going to try to sort of do this on the fly with some AI assistance here and see how this works. Let's see here. There we go. And let's see if we can do that. Great. All right. So we got 18 or so, 20 or so comments from the crowd. And then this was when we entered this into ChatGPT and asked for an aggregation of this. So some discussion of AI, digital technologies, new structural logics, sort of technological change and how this reshapes and this came up in earlier conversation. And kind of this human AI interaction, right? And how this relates to org design and structure. Emphasis on sort of process, designing, sort of ongoing evolution of design. And then also, and this also came up in a question that somebody that one of the attendees raised about interorganizational coordination, remote. So this came up in Jen's project is about this, and we actually cite another paper in the special issue introduction by Christina Gibson and co-authors, also about hybridity and remote work. And then a lot of interest in grand challenges, societal challenges, inequality, and this is something we touched on in the special issue, but certainly interest in this as well. So yeah, a lot of sort of interesting directions to go with this. Yeah, I guess maybe, that we could sort of open this up to the panelists as well. Are there any other sort of reactions, reflections, current work to note on this topic, or any other sort of reactions to the conversation we've had so far? Yeah, Siobhan, please.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you, Michael, for organizing this. It's really fun to get all of these authors together and hear from them. One of the things I can't help but think about when I look at the slide, maybe it's because I teach field methods, is what are the implications for our research designs? And how do we capture the process of designing, from the outside? So often some of these choices are made in private. I think some of us on this panel got access to that information, but also you kind of have to be on the ground before these decisions are made. If we're going to watch how people are responding and making choices with the technologies in front of them to build the organizations for the future, we kind of just have to get a foothold and be there to observe in the right sort of conditions. So I view it as a very difficult challenge for research design, but maybe others on the panel have ideas.
Kathy, please.
Yeah, I just had two comments. First of all, great idea, Siobhan. Nice to see you. Hope you're doing well. One thing that struck me in terms of methods was, first of all, maybe more use. I think it was Fabrizio. Someone said we should use more field experiments. I think that's actually a really great idea. More field experiments certainly doesn't solve all the problems that you're talking about, but certainly would nail some mechanisms. Also, some computational simulation, like we all did. Not everybody's favorite method, but it does let you narrow down into what precise mechanisms are. And so I think there's a role, not just for more field work, but also more field experiments and more simulation. The second point I was going to make is I think the idea of new places to study is a great one. In particular, I think we're all seeing the rise of the platform organization. And so seeing platforms, I know some of the papers touched on that, but even more going into platforms as a new kind of an organization that we know some about, but we certainly don't know all there is to know. So I see new methods and really a focus on the new organizations, particularly platforms, as well as the AI agents that Fabrizio brought up.
Sukhbir, please.
The questions that a panelist, that a participant asked today, that's touched a really deep nerve for me. So they asked about all our work on organizations is focused on a single organization often. And Carol and I, as we work together, we're grappling this, especially with sustainability, for example. What one organization does is never enough. It involves a number of organizations to come together and then collaborate to bring about meaningful change. And there's so little work that we have on how do these different organizations come together? How do they design the structures for collaboration? And that, I think, is a really fruitful area for future research, which we're starting to do, but clearly it needs much more effort collectively from us as scholars. Great question, Emily, by the way.
Klaus, please.
I I don't know how it sort of fully relates to all the questions, but it was sort of prompted by the sort of comment on aesthetics and the role that plays. I think there's a way to address some of the novel contexts and the like AI-based structure, if you want, by really sort of unpacking the idea of design a little bit more. I mean, we use the term organization design and have been for decades very sort of unreflectively and just say, hey, there's someone designs, right? But I think that there's something to be said about actually studying designing as a unique sort of process and really understand what designers do, because all those algorithms are designed by someone, maybe distributed, but there is design. Organizational structures are designed by someone in the old-fashioned way of drawing the boxes and stuff. And I think that there's a commonality about this nature of the process of thinking of it as design rather than as improvisation or as sort of adaptation that I think could be fruitfully explored a little bit more about what design actually is in organizations, as opposed to other processes that we also study, but that don't feel like the same thing. And that might also put the design question a little bit in context of how much of organizations is actually designed in that way versus generated through very different processes that we could also fruitfully understand.
Thanks, Klaus. Mike, why don't you take the last word and then we'll transition to wrapping up.
Gosh, okay. I just was this idea was sparked by what part of the AI summary that was talking about the sort of rational versus the normative kind of pieces of design, and it does make me, it is something that I've been thinking about, is the sort of normativity that's involved in organizational design choices. And in the context that I often study around decentralization, I encounter leaders who are making these decisions for very ideological reasons and values-based reasons. It's not a kind of just purely rational consideration. And I think that's probably true of a lot of, like location dependence. I'm thinking about your work, Jen, right? A lot of these founders are probably making these decisions not for just purely sort of mental reasons. And so I think that's very interesting. And it also ties to a question that Carol, you asked about like fit between, do certain types of employees fit with, in my case, decentralized structures, but I think in general, right, we talk about fit between individuals and organizational structures. And I think that that's another area, right, because where normativity comes in, because individuals come with their values and what types of structures fit them and what they care about. And so I think there's a lot of normativity involved in the design choice and design process that I think could be an interesting sort of area of research.
Well, this has been fantastic, and I'm just imagining, like doctoral students on this webinar. There are a lot of dissertation ideas here, and I hope that this is inspiring people to sort of jump into these new questions as well, because clearly there's a lot of interesting work to do. So why don't I pass it over to John to begin to synthesize and wrap us up for the day.
Well, thank you, Trevor. We've covered a lot of ground today. Before I summarize things, Beth, do you have a few final comments, thoughts, reflections?
Sure. So first of all, just wanted to thank you, John and Mike and Trevor, for bringing together this amazing set of papers. I think one of the really fun things was to see how much breadth and depth we had here in terms of covering all of these different levels of analysis and sort of these tensions, as many people brought up, between kind of prior conceptions of staticness and the realities of like organizational practices and processes and how those are actually related. And so I also give my +1 to the org design in motion kind of title. I think it really covers much of what we saw here, and I think the conversation was really generative. I'm not going to reiterate because I just think there's a lot to be done here. And I also would point out, just coincidentally, I taught organizational structure my MBA class last week. So this was also top of mind in my teaching. And I don't know if any of them came, but I invited all of my students to come today. And as you probably, some of you realize, like teaching org structure is not in a core OB course. It's like, we talk about it as like, this is the wheatgrass, the course. It's so dense. It's like, and people don't know how to wrap their heads around how it relates to their own experience in organizations. But I actually think you can link every other topic in my course to what all of you said today, right? Like you can think about how does the design relate to culture? How does it really motivate people, right? Like what does it mean for coordination, obviously? But I think that that's what's so fascinating about the topic. And so I thank all of you for joining us and for participating in this. So
Thank you, Beth. I'd just like to wrap up just reiterating the 3 themes that came out from the survey that was distributed to everybody. And I think that provides some really interesting thoughts about research moving forward when it comes to org design. The first one, as Fabrizio was saying, that 2-letter word, artificial intelligence, that came up a lot in the survey. And I think one of the really interesting questions that is arising is, what's it like, the organization of the future, where you've got humans interacting with AI agents? You might be a human working with 10 AI agents underneath you. How do you organize to do that sort of thing? And we're seeing a lot of startups now which are scaling up very quickly, where you've got very few individuals, but you've got a lot of AI agents. And I think that's going to be a really cool, interesting topic to look at in the future. The second area was around the sort of hybrid workforce and thinking about different ways of working. That seems to be an ever increasingly popular topic, especially coming out of AI. And Jen talked about this in her paper, is around how do we think about organizing these different groups of individuals which are dispersed across different locations, work in different ways. Do the old ways of describing organizational design still apply here? So I keep going back to one of my favorite org design papers for Niche Poranam's 2014 AMR. What's new about organizing? Do all the same principles apply? We're just applying them in a slightly different way with these organizations. And then the last one, and I want to put a plug in for another, if you haven't had enough organization design today, a plug in for another webinar, which is being organized as an SMS masterclass, which is in the chat, which is talking about org design for grand challenges. And that was the third theme that came out of today's discussion, was around how can org design be used to address a range of these grand challenges. And this is a really cool panel being organized by SMS, where we've got a combination of org design scholars like John Joseph, working with presenting alongside industry practitioners from Google, etc., trying to think about how org design plays into how organizations can address these grand challenges moving forward. So I think those are 3 really interesting topics that people can consider in their research agendas as we're moving forward. And in closing, first of all, I'd just like to say thank you to Joan and all of the ASQ team for helping us organize this webinar. And also Mike, you did a great job with the INSEAD folks setting up the webinar as well. I would have been absolutely terrified doing a webinar myself, dealing with all these people crashing and things like that. So I'd like to send out a big thanks to both of those groups. And that's it from me. I think we're closed now.